Hello, a very good evening. It's 9:04 on LBC. 300 years ago, this Saturday, Sir Robert Walpole became Prime Minister. Well, he didn't actually, in a way, because the office wasn't called that then. He became First Lord of the Treasury. And but he became known as Britain's first Prime Minister quite a lot later in his premiership. He was Prime Minister for 21 years, fell from office in 1742. And he was referred to as Prime Minister by quite a few of his opponents, and he regarded it as an insult. Now, obviously, ever since then, anyone who has lived in 10 Downing Street, who's become head of government, has been called Prime Minister. But it was comparatively recent that the phrase Prime Minister was included in legislation. That only happened, I think, in 1905, when Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman was the Liberal Prime Minister at the time. So it is a comparatively recent invention in some ways. And of course, there have been 55 different holders of that office since 1721. Well, as some of you know, I edited a book last year which profiled each of the prime ministers, and it was because of this anniversary that's coming up this weekend. So I thought it might be a good idea to spend an hour talking about what makes a good, a great, or indeed a bad Prime Minister. What qualities do you need to succeed in the office? And how has the office changed over the years? Because the powers of the Prime Minister have changed in some ways, the influence of a Prime Minister and the demands of the job. I mean, a Prime Minister nowadays has to be a great communicator. You don't really succeed if you're not good at communications. And I wonder how Mr. Attlee would have coped with the demands of a 24-hour news media. I wonder if David Lloyd George could have become Prime Minister today, given his, shall we say, preponderances sexually and indeed financially. Many people think Churchill could never have become Prime Minister today because of the scrutiny that modern-day politicians are under. So I want to ask you what you think makes a great Prime Minister, what makes a bad Prime Minister, and maybe give your judgment on who the best and worst ones have been over the last 300 years. And let's not just stick to the ones that we've all lived through, because obviously we all know. I mean, I've lived, I think I counted through 14 different Prime Ministers since I was born when Harold Macmillan was Prime Minister, so that kind of ages me. But it is fascinating to look back in history and learn about some Prime Ministers that frankly I'd never heard of. The Earl of Shelburne, for example, the Duke of Portland. As you may know, I host a podcast series on the Prime Ministers at the moment. Each podcast covers one Prime Minister, and you can download that wherever you get your podcast from. Now, rather than me talking to you for the next hour about my views about the role of Prime Minister, I've invited 3 experts onto the programme to help me do that. We will come to your calls in a moment, and we'll also, if you've got questions that you'd like to put to my panel, please feel free as well. 0345 6060 973. Sue Cameron is broadcaster and journalist, good friend of the programme. Sue, I think you've been covering Prime Ministers since, shall we say, the days of Margaret Thatcher, or maybe even before that?
I thought for a moment you were going to say since the days of Walpole.
As if.
I've certainly written about quite a few of them, yes.
Steve Richards has also written a book called The Prime Minister's Reflections on Leadership from Wilson to Johnson. Steve, we'll talk. I suspect we'll talk quite a bit about Harold Wilson over the course of this programme. Why did you stop at Harold Wilson? Why didn't you go back further?
Well, for 2 reasons. One, I wanted to write about those that I had observed either from a distance or very closely. So that was a selfish reason, because I think the way prime ministers are portrayed in the media tends to sort of become that they're stereotypes and caricatures. I think they're all much more interesting, those that I've observed very closely. And the second one is, it was trying to look at prime ministers in this modern era with television, social media coming into it as well, and how the pressures changed with that. So it was a combination of the two. I call it the modern era, and that's really defined by the media and television and then the social media.
And we're also joined by Sir Anthony Selden. His book, I think today's publication day, isn't it, Anthony, of your book, The Impossible Office, The History of the British Prime Minister. It's a fascinating title. Why have you called it The Impossible Office?
Well, thanks very much. And indeed, published, Iain, on no less than April Fool's Day, which I think was a joke of somebody or other. And, well, look, because, it's a question. Is it an impossible office? Why have so many not perform properly? If we take your audience tonight listening to this programme, how many can name the 55 prime ministers? I mean, I think that you would certainly want to give a casket of champagne to anybody who could name all 55. We can hardly name more than maybe 10 or 15, whereas with American presidents, if this was a much less distinguished audience, obviously, but in America, they'd probably be able to name 3/4 of the presidents. So, why have so many of these people been anonymous? Why have they made so little difference to the office? And I think it's because the demands of the office are really incompatible with the expectations.
That's a really interesting phrase you used there, making a difference. It reminds me of the phrase that Richard Nixon used to use. You have to be in the arena to make a difference. And obviously all of these people have become politicians. And that has changed. The reasons that people go into politics, I guess, has changed over the centuries. You were kind of born into it often in the 18th century. The number of prime ministers in the 18th century who had exactly the same backgrounds. They all went to Eton. They all went to Oxford. Bit like today, Steve Richards.
Yeah. Well, Anthony, in his book, begins with this imaginary dialogue between Walpole and Boris Johnson. And of course, they both went to Eton and Oxford. And so there are, the imaginary dialogue, which is great fun, and the book is both insightful and great fun, both highlights the many differences in that time span, but also the similarities. And that, we had a break from the Etonian prime ministers after Macmillan and Douglas Home, but they have come back in this period big time.
With a vengeance.
With a vengeance.
You can say that again. Sue Cameron, let me come to you. Let's start looking at the qualities that you need to have to become a great prime minister. What would you say would be the number one quality that you need?
Absolutely and undoubtedly, you need luck. So much depends on luck, from whether you can get a big majority, and it might not be down to you, to whether something happens, some great event. It was Macmillan, I think, who said what he feared most were events, dear boy, events. And people just get clobbered by something totally unexpected. The pandemic is the latest thing, but there are so many. Economic collapse, often the Prime Minister hasn't been responsible. He's inherited something, or something comes out of absolutely nowhere, 9/11 or whatever it may be, and it really, really stymies them. And there is nothing, or very little, I think, that you can really do to guard against that. I think the other things that they need to have an ability to manage people. Manage sounds rather a boring kind of company word, but the best prime ministers, one way or another, sometimes they've bullied people. Margaret Thatcher springs to mind. Sometimes they've been much more consensual, like Attlee, but they must be able to manage the cabinet and the House of Commons. And all great prime ministers have been able to manage the House of Commons. And they have to manage their party. And today, which wasn't so much the case in the past, so it's always been there, they have to manage the media. We say, well, gosh, it's so different now because of 24/7 news and all the rest of it, and you've got social media. But even in the 18th century, you had terrible cartoons, much ruder than you'd ever have in a newspaper today. So people did still, even then, have to be able to cope with the media one way or another.
And Anthony Selden, certainly in the 18th century and for the first half of the 19th century, it wasn't necessarily the media that prime ministers had to address. It was the monarch. You had to keep in with the monarch, didn't you?
You absolutely did. Look, the monarch was all powerful the century before, in the 17th century, until carelessly Charles I lost his head, or became separated from it in Whitehall in January 1649. But the monarch came back in 1660, and a new monarchy in 1688. All the time, Iain, they were becoming less and less powerful. And as the power of the monarchy was declining, the power of Parliament was increasing. And Walpole came into existence because the monarch recognised that unless he had a figure loyal to him who was in Parliament, sorting things out in Parliament, he'd never get the money that the king needed to run those vast palaces. So he appointed Walpole. And, for 100 years, it was a jockeying in power between the monarchy and between the prime minister. Sometimes the monarchy was more powerful. Those Hanoverians, George III early on, before he went completely, unfortunately, psychotically mad, and then at other times, the PM, Pitt, the younger, Liverpool, really extraordinary people. So it wasn't, I think, till the 19th century, Iain, with Queen Victoria, that the power seriously began to ebb away from the monarchy towards the prime minister, particularly with the beginning of the franchise. And, the moment that you had the people having the power in Parliament, not the toffs, the aristocrats, but the people progressively getting the franchise, the electorate extending, then the case for a monarchy having power became very, very strange. And so the PM took the power as the leader in Parliament.
And Steve, of the prime ministers that you studied in your book, from Harold Wilson onwards, who would you say were the best at managing the media, the best at communicating with the voters?
The election winners. And I argue in my book that to be a successful prime minister, you have to be a political teacher. You have to explain why you are doing what you are doing. It is staggering how many political leaders just do things and assume that the act of doing is an explanation, whereas the successful ones, Thatcher, electorally successful, Thatcher, Blair, Wilson, always began with an argument about why they were acting in the way they were. Thatcher, with her sort of homilies about her dad's shop in Grantham never spending more than they earned, was a kind of explanation, very crude, of monetarism. And similarly, there are other examples with Blair and Wilson. They were teachers. And it is staggering. For example, Keir Starmer appearing behind or in front of a load of flags. Why? You don't just do it, you must clear the ground by explaining why. And I think those are the most successful prime ministers that I study in my book. They are teachers. They first of all teach themselves. They decide why they are acting the way they are. Then they teach the media and the wider electorate. Then they fill in the policies as a sort of natural development to the answering the why question. And I would say 90% of leaders in British politics don't address the why question, and they're all doomed.
Well, lots of questions and lots of calls coming in at the moment. We'll come to your calls in just a moment and explore a few more reasons as to why good prime ministers get to power and why some prime ministers don't quite make it. It's 17 minutes past 9.
This is LBC. Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
21 minutes past 9 on Saturday. It's the 300th anniversary of Sir Robert Walpole coming to power. We're looking at the office of Prime Minister, what makes a good Prime Minister or a bad Prime Minister. We have Steve Richards, Sir Anthony Selden and Sue Cameron helping us to do that. And then we're going to come to your calls in about 5 minutes' time. 0345 6060 973. If you have a question for the panel or you'd like to give your views on what makes a good Prime Minister, do feel free to give us a call. Let's look at the ability to be a diplomat and to handle foreign relations, because obviously that is a theme right down the ages. But the challenges of a modern day Prime Minister are possibly different from those of the 19th century. We don't necessarily go around invading countries. We don't have an empire anymore. Sue Cameron, let's start with you. Who do you think, looking back over the years, has been our greatest diplomatic Prime Minister?
Well, I think it's important, as you've just said, how different it was then to now. I mean, apart from anything else, it took weeks to get an order out from London to a foreign part, literally a couple of months. And of course, we did have an empire, and we did have much, much more power, and we were much more of a force in the world. Whereas today, we're not a power in the same way at all. It's soft power. And in the past, prime ministers didn't supersede the foreign secretary in the way that has happened over the last years. I mean, now, if you're a foreign leader, you want to talk to the prime minister. You don't particularly want to talk, fine to let your people talk to the foreign secretary's people, but you want to talk to the top person. Whereas in the past, when they didn't have telephones, let alone aeroplanes, that just wasn't the case. And the foreign secretary was a much, much more powerful figure. And there were a number of people, some of them became prime minister later, who were very crucial in foreign affairs. I mean, from Pitt the Younger, Palmerston, who was known for sending in the gunboats. So there were a number of prime ministers who had been very important in foreign affairs. I guess you might say possibly Pitt the Younger or Palmerston, I think, would be. Disraeli, of course, was the great imperialist, made Queen Victoria an empress, which she loved. She thought Disraeli was wonderful. But it has changed an enormous amount.
Anthony, if we look at modern-day prime ministers, I'm thinking back over the past, say 40 or 50 years, not many of them had much foreign policy experience. I mean, John Major had been Foreign Secretary for all of 3 months, I think, when he became Prime Minister. Jim Callaghan had been Foreign Secretary, but most of them come into the job with comparatively little experience. And those that stay in the job, it tends to be their second term that they really get into foreign affairs, isn't it?
So I think what happens, Ian, is that they get bored, frankly. I mean, it is frankly just so much more fun hopping on a plane and going off first class cabin and going off and seeing world leaders and swanning around international conferences than it is going through the details of gas policy or the details of how pensions is going to be rolled out. So they do get absolutely, as you say, progressively interested in foreign policy as it goes on. And Lloyd George, Sue was picking out there really interestingly that tendency that's happened since the 19th century for the PM to become more involved. Lloyd George, Prime Minister almost exactly 100 years ago, and a Prime Minister who himself very nearly died from the epidemic of the day, which was the Spanish flu. He came that close, that was very close, to dying, closer even, it's thought, than Boris Johnson. But when he recovered, he also realised that it was a lot more fun going abroad, and it was noted by the cynics of the day. Yes, there were cynics in the newspapers even 100 years ago, that he would spend a lot of his time on foreign policy in hot climates and hot and attractive climates.
What are the difficulties facing new prime ministers on foreign policy, Steve?
That's difficult. Sorry,
I didn't
Steve.
fully catch the question. What the current difficulties did you say?
No, when a prime minister goes into the office, inevitably, generally, and I think of Margaret Thatcher in this regard, she had gone on a few foreign trips as leader of the opposition and met a few foreign leaders, but she then had a war to deal with within a couple of years of coming to office. She then the Russians dubbed her the Iron Lady, which is probably the biggest favour anybody ever did her, and that she became known as the Prime Minister that helped win the Cold War. I mean, how do you get that experience?
It is so interesting that Prime Ministers tend, when they're in opposition, to focus very little on foreign affairs and have very little experience in foreign affairs, and then find their prime ministerial lives defined by it. You mentioned Margaret Thatcher. You could argue that Tony Blair would be defined by Iraq and his relationship with the United States, and David Cameron by Europe and so on. And so it is, I think, as Anthony was suggesting, partly this is the open space for them. The political stage on the domestic arena is very crowded. And Anthony's book chronicles the rise of the Treasury and the power of the Chancellor compared with the Prime Minister. But the reverse is also true, that the Foreign Office has declined in power, and number 10 tends to accumulate power over foreign policy. I mean, when Boris Johnson was Foreign Secretary, he might as well have had it as a junior ministerial post. So irrelevant. Foreign policy was in number 10. And to some extent, that was the case of Cameron's foreign secretaries, perhaps less so with William Hague, but only a little less, and Blair's foreign secretaries. So they become much more preoccupied by these issues when they move into number 10, but become so without a clearly defined view, I think, of Britain's place in the world. I think if you look at prime ministers since 1945, they've all in different ways struggled to find where Britain precisely is in a modern context. And Suez and all the ingredients of Suez were in place with Iraq, to some extent the Falklands and Brexit. And the underlying theme is Britain's place in the world, still not fully defined.
Okay, let's go to Dan. Sorry, Sue, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think one of the things with foreign policy is personal relations and personality. There is a story, which I'm sure is true, of Thatcher when she first met Gorbachev, and she said to him, now I want to ask you, through the interpreters, can we be absolutely frank with each other? So he said, yes, of course. And she said, good. She said, because I want you to know I hate communism. But if you choose to be communist within your own borders, that's all right. And apparently Gorbachev pretty much fell in love with her on the spot. So a lot does depend on personal relationships. And she got on very well with Reagan, of course.
You see, I think that's a really important point, because when Donald Trump met Kim Jong-un, I thought, it's quite difficult to go to war with somebody that you've actually had dinner with. Personal relations, I think, count for an awful lot. Dan, I'm going to come to you, but in a couple of minutes. It's 9:30 on LBC. Let's get the news headlines from Zora Suleiman.
Almost 1 in 7 people who test positive for coronavirus still suffer symptoms 3 months later. Official figures suggest 1.1 million people in the UK have experienced long COVID. Scotland Yard says an officer's conviction for belonging to a right-wing terror group is a unique case. 22-year-old Ben Hannum joined the Met Police after lying about his association with banned organisation National Action. And forecasters say parts of the UK could be hit by thunder snow over Easter. The Met Office says they'll see a huge swing in weather conditions, with temperatures dropping to single digits by Monday. LBC weather will overcast across northern Scotland and eastern England, with clear spells elsewhere. A frosty night for Northern Ireland and southern Scotland, a low of -2.
This is LBC with Iain Dale on LBC.
9:34. We're talking about the office of Prime Minister on the 300th anniversary of Sir Robert Walpole coming to power. Steve Richards, Anthony Selden, Sue Cameron with me, and we're going to go to your calls now. Dan is in Lancaster. Hello, Dan.
Hi, Ian. So I think that what makes a good Prime Minister, I think it's the ability to speak to people about the time that they're in and the time they're moving into, and to connect your policies and ideas with that national story. You think about Clement Attlee and the post-war recovery, Margaret Thatcher and that move away from 70s economic turmoil, Tony Blair in the turn of the millennium. I'd say that a good Prime Minister manages events, whereas a bad Prime Minister is managed by events.
Oh, that's a good one, isn't it? Sue Cameron, what do you make? I think that's a really good, insightful comment.
Sounds really interesting, good way to put it. But I think saying that a good Prime Minister can manage events, I think that's sometimes very, very difficult. And it depends on so many things, not least the size of his or her majority. If they've got a small majority, you just can't do it. And it's very, very, very hard. Or if you've got a huge event, Heath, for instance, terribly well qualified, very, very able man. And yet what did for him, or one of the main things that did for him, was the oil crisis in the early 1970s. And following on from that, the miners' strike, etc., etc. And it wasn't just something that you could say, well, I'm going to take control of this. So I agree with you in principle, and some prime ministers are far too much, perhaps, controlled by events. But I think saying they ought to be able to cope with events, it makes it a bit too simple. It doesn't appreciate the difficulties and the things that come at you in number 10. It's everything from a scandal in one of the newspapers to some terrible event, a war or refugees, something that's really serious. Gus O'Donnell, when he was the cabinet secretary, the top civil servant, when people used to say, there's an emergency, Gus always used to say, well, how many people are dead? He said, because before that, it's not really an emergency. But sadly, often, prime ministers do have to deal with things where people have died.
Dan, who's your greatest ever Prime Minister?
Well, they're all a bit tricky. I personally really like Gordon Brown, but I'm not sure many people on the panel would agree with that one.
I don't know. Anthony and Steve have written extensively about Gordon Brown. I'm sure Sue has as well. Anthony, let's come to you just very quickly on Gordon Brown, because he is somebody who obviously he had to cope with the financial crash, and in a sense that probably defines his premiership in a good way, but also a bad way.
Absolutely. So Dan, I agree about Gordon Brown being really interesting as a human being, and he's, I think, the most interesting and profound and deep figure to have been Prime Minister since 1945. Very moody, very gloomy. Of course, had a personal tragedy when he lost his daughter Jennifer. He lost his effectively part of his eyesight, stopped him playing sport and doing many of the things he'd have loved to have done. And he was pretty gloomy, let's be honest. He's also a brilliant historian, written really movingly books about courage and heroism. So a really profound human being. And he was lucky, if you like, in that he wasn't Prime Minister for very long, as you know, only 3 years. But the big crisis on his watch was one that he was very, very good at dealing with, which was finance, the global financial crisis. And he led Britain, arguably, as well as any country in the world, was led at that time.
OK, let's move on to James in Ayrshire. Hello, James.
Hello, Ian. Hi. I agree with the previous caller, at least who's concentrating on contemporary Prime Ministers. The idea that 19th century Prime Ministers could be described as great, there was no universal suffrage then. Who was the judge and jury back then? These men inhabited their own very privileged, very entitled world. And so with the previous caller, I agree that Mr. Attlee and Mr. Churchill, stand head and shoulders above any contemporary Prime Minister. And actually, one of their contemporaries in the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is also the best US president, in my opinion, ever, to be honest with you. So this idea that we should look back to the 19th century and talk about great prime ministers, who was judging them? Well,
I mean, they were the leaders of the country, so I think we've got every right to. I mean, it's very difficult to judge them against modern day standards. I completely accept that.
But nobody voted for them, Ian. No, very, very few people actually put them there. That's the whole issue. Mr. Attlee and Mr. Churchill were judged by the electorate. They were judged by a franchise, and that to me is extremely important. In my opinion.
Let's put that to Steve Richards. I mean, I'm not sure that James has got a really fair point there, because, I mean, we are not looking at it through the prism of the time. We are trying to decide whether someone was a great prime minister. I mean, William Pitt the Younger, for example, he was there from 1783 to 1801, and then for a short time a little bit later. I think by any modern standards, you would have to rank him as one of our greatest prime ministers.
Yeah, I think he does raise an interesting point, which is the way in which accountability has changed in terms of prime ministers. So, I mean, it wasn't that long ago, of course, that Conservative prime ministers emerged, as the cliche went, that even, I think MPs voted for Ted Heath, and that was the first time there was a vote of the parliamentary party. And I detect now a much greater sway in the Conservative Party in favour of the membership, in a way that kind of Tony Benn was pressing for Labour in the early 80s. And so prime ministers behave partly with an awareness of who could get rid of them, who are they dependent on. And I think that has changed in very interesting ways over the years, with profound consequences for the way a prime minister thinks. To take the current example, I think Boris Johnson is acutely aware of the Tory party membership. He obviously, by definition, has to be aware of the wider electorate, but the degree to which he feels accountable to the membership, I think, is very different to Macmillan, even Heath. So there are really interesting changing relationships between prime ministers, electorates, members, parliamentary parties that have quite profound impact on them, I think.
James, your best and worst prime minister?
Well, the best for me was Mr. Attlee. I don't want to do worst, Ian, to be quite honest with you. There are so many to choose from. So forgive me. I'll let somebody else pick that. But Mr. Attlee rebuilt. Mr. Attlee, best peacetime prime minister. Mr. Churchill, best wartime prime minister.
James, can I just say there, Ian, James, in Iain Dale's brilliant book on the 55 prime ministers, I was lucky enough to be asked by Iain to write about Attlee, and I reached the same conclusion that you did, that of all the domestic prime ministers who were not there at a time of a war, like Churchill, Clement Attlee, the great Labour leader after the Second World War, was the best.
Yes, I agree with that, yeah.
OK, James, thank you very much. I think the point about worst prime ministers is that sometimes a prime minister gets a bit of a bad rap, but only for one thing, like Lord North, for example, who lost America. People put him right down the bottom of the list. If you look at his domestic record, as Nicky Morgan points out in the essay that she wrote in the book, he actually had quite an impressive domestic record. But no one remembers that now, because most prime ministers are remembered for one thing only. Jane is in Liverpool. Hello, Jane.
Hello. I would really like to know what the panel think, what sort of PM Jeremy Corbyn would have made, given that, I'll just make 3 quick points. For example, he seems so inflexible. He refused the Queen's invite to dine with Donald Trump. He wouldn't talk to Israel. And he appeared to have no criticism of Hamas's methods. For example,
OK, all right, well, let's put that to our panel. Anthony, let's start with you. What kind of Prime Minister would Jeremy Corbyn have been? Obviously a bit of a counterfactual here.
Well, I think going to agree with the way that Jane is going there, because I think that Jane is going to be saying that she doesn't think that he would have cut the mustard. And to be a successful Prime Minister, you can't be, your views have to be within a certain set of margins, parameters. And if you're too far outside, it just isn't going to work. And if you're going to reject the monarchy and reject the special relationship with the United States and reject the finance and the city and Britain's traditional partners abroad, then it is going to be very tricky. We, in truth, haven't had a prime minister. Labour's prime ministers, Jane, as you know, were not figures like Jeremy Corbyn or indeed Michael Foot from 80 to 83, who were out on the far left. They were pretty centre figures, centre left like Clement Attlee, or centre right like Tony Blair, or centre like Harold Wilson became and like Gordon Brown became. So I think it's an interesting one. As Iain said, we're never going to know. I mean, look, he might have become like Ramsay MacDonald, the first Labour Prime Minister, did, really quite right-wing and establishment.
I doubt that very much.
Used to love it because he would fawn all over the king. But so you never know. But I think it's unlikely.
And just very briefly, Steve Richards, you would have loved to have done a new edition of your book with a chapter on Jeremy Corbyn, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I would have loved it. And I think it would have been interesting and surprising. I actually think, some of the things Anthony mentioned, he had already displayed a counterintuitive expediency. He was absolutely clear he was going to do nothing about the monarchy. I think he would have attempted to form a close relationship as possible with Biden, obviously not with Trump. He had been pragmatic on Europe. He was an anti-European who had been forced to be expedient. So in those things, I think he might have surprised people. However, he didn't have a leaderly bone in his body. His rise to the top of the Labour Party remains one of the astonishing stories of British politics ever. It's like plucking a tennis player in a local park onto the centre court of Wimbledon. He didn't want to be it, he had never thought about it, and suddenly he became it. So there would have been all kinds of problems, not least with the pandemic. But he would have surprised some people, I suspect, with a streak of pragmatism.
So I'm going to just very, very quickly, 30 seconds, because I need to go to a break.
OK, one of the things you mustn't forget about Corbyn, I think he'd been a terrible Prime Minister for all the reasons we've heard, but he had a huge impact. He turned Labour into a mass party, which nobody had done for ages. And when everybody was saying we've got to end this austerity, Labour will never make it unless they take a tougher line on spending, he said, no, we've got to have more spending. And it was, for a while, immensely popular. So I think he had a huge influence. I don't think, much bigger than is sometimes given credit for, but I don't think he'd have been any good as a Prime Minister, which was why the public in the end didn't want him.
OK, Jane, your best and worst Prime Minister?
Oh, gosh. I think, was it, my history's gone, was it Palmerston? Who was it who started in the 1800s? The social reforms, getting the children out of the mines and all that sort of thing. That must have been the best.
Anthony's saying that was Gladstone. I think you could also put in a bid for Henry Campbell Bannerman here, because it was him that started all the social reforms in the early part of the 20th century. Asquith and Lloyd George get all the credit, but it was actually Henry Campbell Bannerman that started it. Jane, thank you very much. We'll come to more of your calls in a second. It's 9:48.
Coming up at 10 on LBC, Tom Swarbrick.
It's just not British, says Sir Keir Starmer of vaccine passports, despite a poll saying Britain back COVID passports in general and for specific areas, including pubs. Who speaks for Britain on this?
Tom Swarbrick on LBC. Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 9:51. We're talking about the qualities needed to be a good Prime Minister, or maybe the deficiencies that we've all noticed in bad Prime Ministers. Steve Richards, Anthony Seldon and Sue Cameron are with me. Let's go back to your calls. Dave is in Brittany in France. Hello, Dave.
Hi, Ian. Not the first time caller to your show. Your book arrived yesterday, by the way.
Excellent.
The one, why can't we all just get along? So thanks for getting that dispatched so quickly. I'd also like to just pay tribute to Anthony Seldon, because he was a current affairs teacher at school of mine in the 1980s when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, and he first piqued my interest in current affairs and politics. I did tell him this at the first-year school reunion a couple of years ago, so thank you for that, Anthony.
Well, I'm glad to be able to reunite the two of you.
Well, yes, okay. So just on the topic in question, I'm referring really to the very recent history, and I would say that a very strong sense of direction and a determination to carry out a particular agenda is what probably defines a good Prime Minister. Whether or not you believe in the policy outcomes that they implement, and I think the three that come to mind for me are Thatcher, clearly. She was very clear about what she wanted to do in freeing up markets and particularly breaking the power of the trade unions. Blair as well, in that post-sort of Tory era, he was very clear about what he wanted to do in making Labour re-electable by breaking up Clause 4, and he almost kind of moved them into a sort of social justice-minded capitalist party, if you like, because he seemed to accept the mantra of free markets, not a traditional Labour thing, but with a strong sense of social justice, particularly he had Gordon Brown in tow as his Chancellor. And then lastly, I think David Cameron had a very strong vision for what he wanted to do. He certainly recognised the need to detoxify the Tories when he came out with the mantra that, you know, blue is the new green, when the Tories went very green in the run-up to the 2010 election. And then he and George Osborne obviously had a very clear sense of direction on cutting the deficit and cutting back the size of the state. Many may say we went too far. I actually think Cameron and Osborne may well still be in power had he not lost the referendum. But I think we've completely lost our way since then.
That's an interesting point in that
we've had.
I mean, I suspect contemporary historians are already writing David Cameron off as a really bad Prime Minister because of the Brexit referendum. That there are many Prime Ministers in history who are written off at the time as bad Prime Ministers who historians later come to re-evaluate. Anthony Seldon, do you think that David Cameron is going to be one of those?
I think, his reputation, Ian, is so low at the moment, not the least with all the Greensill stuff, that it can only rise from where it is now. Can I say I also agree with David very much about the importance of a PM having a strong agenda. Some have the agenda thrust upon them if they happen to be there at a time of a major international war, then that provides them with their work and their focus. Others, like Thatcher, very much have that. Can I finally say of David that you still owe me that essay on the second Margaret Thatcher term, please? I'm sorry to enter for public humiliation.
Well, Dave, you know my email address. If you want to send it to me, I'll pass it on to Anthony. Thank you very much. James is in Sydenham. James, if you could be relatively brief, I'd be grateful.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Hi, Ian.
Hi.
Looking at my heritage and looking at Prime Ministers, I'll have to go to the 19th century. You got Benjamin Gladstone, you got you got Benjamin Disraeli, you got William Gladstone, you got Robert Peel, the amount of social reform. If you look at the police force, if you look at the amount of the extension of the franchise, if you look at Gladstone himself, he was in politics for over 60 years. He became Prime Minister on 4 different occasions. If you look at Disraeli with One Nation conservatism, and if I look back to where I grew up myself in Ghana, the impacts, because in 1874, the British bought out the Dutch, so Ghana became purely the Gold Coast, and I'm sure it's due to Benjamin Disraeli and that kind of thing. So the British influence, which created opportunities for us, the extension of the English language, the building of schools, and then the Gold Coast, this is now Ghana. So the influence, the 19th century prime ministers really influenced beyond Britain itself. I mean, social reforms and all of that. And the school I went to itself was established in 1874, and I can see that when Britain decided to expand their influence, it created opportunities with the school I went to in Ghana and all of that. So, yeah, I mean, I would say 19th century, my favorites, William Gladstone and Benjamin Disraeli.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, James. Right, we literally have 2 minutes left. I'm going to go to each of you and ask for your top best Prime Minister since 1721 and your worst Prime Minister since 1721. Sue Cameron.
I don't think you can have a worst one. I think there's a lot to choose from, but I don't think you can because circumstances have changed so much. I mean, Walpole had to be in with the king. He needed the king for his bribery and corruption. He actually spent a bit of time in the Tower, I think, for bribery. But he was dependent on the king, and that is so different to now. You can't have a worse one. I think if the best one, I would agree, I'm a bit boring, but I would say probably Attlee or Thatcher. Attlee, I think, was in a way the one whose legacy has been possibly the most enduring, but I think it's difficult to say.
We are running out of time. Anthony?
Absolutely agree. You can't possibly have a worst Prime Minister.
I can.
Said that, I'm going for Anthony Eden as my worst Prime Minister. Brought the country right down, lied to Parliament. Best Prime Minister, Pitt the Younger, contemporary of Keats. I mean, and a genius, like the poet Keats.
OK, Steve Richards, 30 seconds.
OK, the best ones are the game changers, whether you agree with the way the game has changed. So they have been covered. I would just say on Cameron, he actually got, I think, a very generous press while he was Prime Minister. His reputation is low now, but that, I think, is a more realistic assessment. He struck me as one of the more shallow Prime Ministers, and we're living through the...
OK, quick, best and worst, because we have to finish.
Well, I've just said that Cameron's in there on that.
OK, all right. Well, thank you to all three of you. Steve Richards, Sir Anthony Seldon and Sue Cameron. The Prime Minister's podcast is available. In fact, Anthony's on it, the one that will be released on, tomorrow, I think. It's a bonus episode. Thank you very much for all of your calls during the programme tonight. I'll be back with you on Monday.